When you see that huge, just undeniable gap between the ultra-rich and the poor, what is it that makes it feel, well, fundamentally unjust?
That's a great question.
Is it just that one person needs more, or is it that the wealthy person maybe didn't really earn what they have?
And we argue about this constantly.
We do, and it's often because we're using completely different sets of rules without even realizing it.
That is the exact intellectual mess that the political theorist David Miller really aims to clear up. We're diving into the world of distributive justice, and the problem is that most people, and frankly most philosophers, have assumed there's only one master formula to figure it all out.
And today we want to invite you to discover a new, in-depth approach to book coverage with this extended summary. Now, unlike our previous review, which offers a really focused analysis, this feature is designed to deliver a comprehensive overview.
We'll be tracing the intellectual roots, the key arguments, and the real-world impact of this subject.
And if you appreciate this expanded format, if you find it helpful, please do let us know. Your feedback is what's going to help shape our future content.
Our subject is David Miller's really significant 1999 work, Principles of Social Justice. Miller's core argument is that social justice isn't one single idea. It has to be understood through a mix of three different, but equally legitimate, principles.
And those are desert, need, and equality.
Exactly.
And for everyone listening, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM, which we use for deeper, more dynamic book summaries. Now, Miller was writing this at a time when liberal democracies were grappling with huge new economic realities.
Things like globalization, political multiculturalism.
Right, and his project was really pushing back against these earlier liberal theories that insisted on finding one single principle of justice, like the kind of pure equality some followers of Rawls demanded.
Or, on the other side, the pure market desert that libertarians favor.
So what's the core thesis, then?
Well, what's so fascinating is Miller's main claim. Justice is plural. And it's deeply contextual. He's not trying to create some simple ranking system where, say, need always beats desert. Instead, he's saying these three principles are each appropriate to different forms of human association. So if you think about markets or families or a democratic community,
each one needs a different primary principle to feel fair.
yes. You wouldn't distribute affection in a family based on who deserves it most, for example. That would be absurd.
Okay, let's unpack this methodology because that's where he really breaks from the pack. He doesn't start from some abstract thought experiment.
No veil of ignorance here.
He begins right here in the real world with the everyday arguments we all have about what's fair. For him, social justice is very focused on the distribution of benefits and burdens among members of a specific political community.
And that leads right to his defensive method. Miller argues, quite powerfully, I think, that these abstract philosophical theories often just ignore how ordinary citizens actually understand fairness.
Which creates a huge gap.
A chasm, really, between high theory, which might be logically perfect but politically impossible, and any kind of reform you could actually pass in a real democracy.
So he deliberately brings in empirical social science. He's looking at survey research, studies on what people think about distribution. But I have to ask, if you're relying on public opinion, aren't you just telling people what they want to hear?
Yeah.
Doesn't that risk losing the philosopher's critical edge?
That's the key, and he defends it really well. He uses that empirical data not to define justice, but to understand the raw material, the moral intuitions that people are already working with.
Okay, so it's a starting point, not the final word.
Exactly. For instance, surveys show people generally agree a CEO should earn much more than a janitor. That's an appeal to desert. But they also believe both of them deserve equal access to health care. That's an appeal to need.
Two different principles for two different situations.
Right. The philosopher then steps in to refine those intuitions into coherent principles, which lets him keep that critical edge needed to challenge institutions that are failing.
That makes perfect sense. And the evidence he presents shows that people do this systematically. They appeal to desert, need, and equality, but the one they pick depends entirely on the context.
Merit and contribution in the market, but a switch to need when you're talking about, say, disaster relief. The context dictates the moral rule.
And this complexity means justice can't be purely a matter of procedure.
No. Chapter number 5 goes into this. Our judgments always blend a concern for fair procedures, like, was the hiring process open to everyone? with a concern for acceptable outcomes.
So was the final distribution of jobs tolerable?
We want fair play, of course, but we also look at the scoreboard. If a perfectly fair market procedure somehow leads to mass starvation, most people are going to reject that outcome as unjust, no matter how pristine the process was.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me, because justice can't just be about laws. It has to exist in human behavior.
It has to live in our everyday interactions.
Miller notes that a culture of justice has to shape how people treat each other in their ordinary roles, as employers, as customers, as citizens. It requires virtues like fairness and reciprocity, not just a well-designed system.
This intellectual synthesis, which bridges grand theory with the ethics of everyday life, actually reminds us of our Mindful Moments YouTube channel. We offer AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all with the goal of inspiring reflection and rational thought.
And we really aim to provide insights that bridge that gap between theory and practice, which is valuable for anyone, but especially for aspiring authors and critical thinkers.
So let's transition into his systematic analysis of the three principles, starting with desert.
Miller gives a very strong defense of desert, but he's incredibly careful about his definition. He insists it has to be distinguished from just raw, natural talent.
Right. If you're born a piano prodigy, that gift itself doesn't mean you deserve anything.
So what does then?
Desert is always conditional. It's based on things you can control, like effort, your actual contribution, or how well you perform in a specific role. But, and this is critical, it has to be anchored in socially recognized roles, and it presupposes fair background conditions.
Meaning, you deserve a bonus for working hard, but only if the whole system you were working in was basically just to begin with.
Precisely.
Applying this to jobs and pay is a big part of the book, and it leads to that famous section where he offers 2 cheers for meritocracy. So meritocracy is selection based on qualifications. Why only 2 cheers? Why not 3? I mean, it's surely better than just giving jobs to your relatives, right?
It absolutely is, and that's your first 2 cheers. Meritocracy is a huge leap in fairness compared to patronage or discrimination. But Miller argues it's not the final answer. It can still be profoundly unjust on its own.
If the procedures are fair, if everyone can compete openly, how can the outcome still be unjust?
The injustice creeps in when we ignore the structural context. If some people start with massive disadvantages, poor schools, bad nutrition, no resources, the playing field isn't level.
Some meritocracy relies on developing talent.
And developing talent costs money and resources. If background inequalities distort who even gets a chance to develop merit in the first place, then the competition is rigged before it even starts.
So merit really only works as a fair principle after we've met other requirements, like a basic level of equality.
You've got it. And what's more, a pure meritocracy completely ignores claims of need. You could be the most meritorious person in the country, but if hiring you means a whole community loses its only doctor, the outcome's a problem for social justice as a whole. Merit has to be constrained by a concern for the vulnerable.
That brings us perfectly to the independent claim of need in chapter number 10. To each, according to his needs. Miller analyzes needs that go beyond just survival.
Yes, he includes basic subsistence and health, but also, importantly, the capabilities you need to be a responsible citizen.
Meaning access to education, to information, a certain level of social participation.
And need, for him, is this powerful, independent principle that inherently justifies redistribution. This is the moral foundation for robust welfare states, for public health care, for state-funded education. A genuine, serious need creates a very strong moral claim that can't just be waved away by appealing to market efficiency.
I get the importance of meeting basic needs, but the classic objection to a needs-based system is that it kills incentives. If everyone's needs are met no matter what, why would anyone work? How does he handle that?
Miller is a realist. He acknowledges that you have to balance need with responsibility, but he maintains that the priority of meeting basic human needs is paramount.
So the solution isn't to get rid of the principle of need.
No, it's to design smarter institutions, maybe conditional welfare programs or things that meet needs while minimizing those perverse incentives, rather than just abandoning need-based distribution entirely. The moral claim of need remains urgent.
Finally, we get to equality. Now, when a lot of people argue for equality, they mean material equality. Everyone gets the same slice of the pie. But in chapter number 11, Miller argues for something much more nuanced.
Yes, he distinguishes equality as a distributive pattern from the ideal of social equality. Social equality means people see one another as having equal standing. It means mutual respect. No one is subject to humiliation or domination by others.
Can you give us a concrete example of that? Why should it matter if my neighbor makes 10 times what I do as long as we both have food and healthcare?
It matters greatly if that income gap becomes so vast that the wealthy neighbor can effectively dominate public life. Imagine a small town where one person's extreme wealth lets them buy the local newspaper, bankroll every political candidate, and basically dictate the terms of public debate.
Hmm.
The other citizens might still be materially okay, but they've lost their equal standing. Their ability to participate as free, respected citizens has been crushed by economic power. That, for Miller, is social inequality. It's when economic inequality turns into political and social domination.
That distinction between economic outcomes and social standing is absolutely vital to his whole framework. It moves the conversation away from just counting dollars.
And toward assessing power dynamics, it connects everything back to the idea of the political community.
Which brings us to his conclusion. So, to summarize the pluralist argument, the three principles, need, desert, and equality, are all legitimate.
All legitimate moral claims. But their priority depends entirely on the social relationship you're looking at. In a for-profit market, desert is primary. In a natural disaster, need becomes primary.
And in the courtroom or the polling booth, social equality has to be absolute.
Exactly.
But the real world is messy. What happens when they collide? For example, should access to higher education be based on desert, so merit, or on need and equality, like universal access?
That's where the tension of pluralism really shows. Miller would say we have to look at the institution's primary purpose. If the purpose is to produce high-skilled workers for the economy, merit might take the lead, but it has to be constrained by making sure disadvantaged students have a fair shot.
But if the purpose is basic citizen formation, then equality and need would have to dominate.
Right. His theory gives you a framework for resolving those conflicts by clarifying the values that are at stake.
The book was written at the turn of the century. Has this nationally focused idea of social justice really survived the last 2 decades of intense globalization?
Miller contended that social justice still primarily applies within bounded nations. The reason is pragmatic. It's only within these communities that citizens share the institutions and responsibilities needed to actually enforce these principles.
So while global obligations exist,
The strong, enforceable demands of social justice, the power to redistribute wealth and guarantee social standing, that remains rooted in the nation's state. His principles are meant to guide reforms to welfare states and democratic institutions within that context.
it's an incredibly rich summary. He really manages to reconcile these warring views of justice by showing they just reflect different emphases on shared underlying principles that depend on context.
So the next time you call an institution or an outcome unjust, just pause. Ask yourself which of the three principles, need, desert, or social equality, is the most appropriate one for that specific relationship. That's the critical, reflective thinking he wants you to practice.
That's a powerful challenge to leave with our listener. We've really covered a lot of ground in summarizing Miller's complex and ambitious work.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book critique, and please subscribe, share, purchase via our link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.